Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the second of four exciting speakers we have in store for you this week. Our events team hopes you're just as excited as we are to embark on this amazing journey. Before we begin, let's talk a bit about what the YEI is. The Youth Economics Initiative is the world's largest coalition of high school economics clubs. We're a student-run 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering youth entrepreneurs and economists with pathways towards careers in finance, economics, and business. Outside of our public events and webinars like this one, we offer a wide-ranging set of resources and opportunities exclusively available to our chapters and members, including our two flagship competitions, Econ Bowl and Econ Olympiad, over 40-plus weeks of engaging economics and financial literacy curriculum, and our multiple initiatives that provide service and research opportunities for students. Over the past year, we've impacted the lives of over 1,200 students, distributed $1,500 in prizes, and established chapters all across the nation and abroad. As we continue to expand, our team is committed to opening new doors for our members and empowering students to find and explore their passion for economics. If you want to know more about the YEI, please check out our website at theyei.org and follow us on our socials. Now, Alyssa will introduce our speaker, Anton Korinek.
Anton Korinek is an associate professor of economics at the Department of Economics of UVA. His current research includes studies of COVID-19 externalities in artificial intelligence. In today's presentation, Professor Korinek will discuss the externalities of COVID-19, which answers the question of whether the government should order citizens to stay at home to limit the spread of the virus. We will have time for a Q&A at the end, so please save your questions until then. Now, everyone, please welcome Professor Anton Korinek.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Alyssa, and thank you, Cheryl and Ian, for setting this up. I am very glad to be with you today. And, you know, we are all going through this terrible pandemic right now, but sometimes there are silver linings to every cloud. And, you know, the fact that we are meeting here for this presentation now across the continent is one of those little silver linings. We would probably not have had this type of meeting 6 months ago before the COVID pandemic started. So I actually wanted to start by asking you a couple of questions. And I wanted to ask all the participants of our call to open the little participants window and get ready to press yes or no. Is everybody ready? Okay, so my first question was, how many of you are planning to pursue economics in their undergraduate studies? If you do, press yes. If you plan on something else, press no. Either answer is perfectly admissible. There's lots of interesting fields. I'm still waiting for a whole bunch of people to press yes or no. Okay, let's wait for 5 more seconds. If you haven't clicked one of the two choices yet, please do so. Okay, so I guess a bit over half of the people in our meeting are planning to pursue economics. Let me clear this all now. Let me ask another question. So in the invitation for this meeting today, the announcement was that I will talk about externalities. How many of you know what an externality is? And it's perfectly fine if you click no. That gives me more of a reason to go through it once more. Okay, waiting for a few more responses. All right, so it's roughly split evenly. Half of all people are familiar with the term, the other half not so much. Thank you all who have participated in the poll. Oh, and I guess I should have clicked yes as well. Yeah, let me first take a step back and let me tell you a little bit about how I came to study economics and ultimately to make it my career. So when I was at your age, I was very much into the hard sciences. I was super interested in physics, chemistry, math, and actually I even participated in the International Chemistry Olympiad. But then when I was roughly in 11th grade, I decided, I really want to study something that deals more directly with the day-to-day concerns of people. And that still allows me to use the kind of quantitative background that I had, because math always came very easily to me. And so I decided to go into economics. Actually, I tried out a bunch of different fields. I tried out law, I tried out economics, and I also did a minor in math. But I really started to like economics. And you know, you all being part of various economics clubs throughout different high schools in the country, you of course know what economics is. But yeah, the layperson often thinks of economics as being about money. But as you all know, it's not just about money. It's much more broadly about how do we distribute resources in the economy? How do we allocate resources? And there's a lot of questions that go way more beyond what's, for example, the study of finance, which would be more directly concerned with money. So in what I am studying, I look mostly at so-called externalities. Now, what are externalities? In some ways, you can say that externalities are the dark underbelly of the market economy. So as economists, we generally think that markets work quite well. We generally think that markets can play a useful role in society in allocating resources, because they make sure that if one person values something more than another person, that person can buy it and the other person can sell it. And as a result of that, the market achieves a more efficient allocation than what we would have otherwise. Now, the problem is markets don't always work perfectly. And that's precisely where those externalities come in. So specifically, an externality is when I engage in some form of economic activity or some form of action, and it has a negative effect on someone else. And I guess you can immediately see the link to a pandemic like COVID-19. If I am sick and let's say I go out and party, or even I just go back to school, go back to my university and spread around the virus, I will make others sick. And that's one of these externalities that make the market stop functioning well. And the fundamental issue there is in market transactions, both parties of an interaction, for example, the buyer and the seller, consent to what's going on. When there are externalities, there is an adverse effect on somebody who has not consented to the interaction. So for example, I go out, I infect somebody, that person obviously has not consented to being infected, and that's why there is an infection externality. So externalities are byproducts of activities that we can call it the recipient or the victim of that byproduct has not consented to, and therefore has not agreed to pay a price for or receive a compensation for. And you know, when this whole pandemic started around February, I started to think more and more about, well, how should we wrap our heads around the externalities of diseases? How should we link the externalities of diseases with economic activities that are relevant for sustaining our livelihoods? And how should we think about people's choices and the efficiency versus the inefficiency of people's choices when they go about their daily lives, when there exist such externalities, such adverse effects that my actions can impose on others? And having said that, let me now share my screen and go into my actual presentation, where I want to tell you a little bit about a paper that I have written with a colleague of mine. It's entitled COVID-19 Infection Externalities and Public Health Strategies, Pursuing Herd Immunity or Containment. So you've probably all heard a lot about the trade-off between lives versus livelihoods in the news in recent months. And what we can see again and again is that commentators suggest that we face this stark choice in our policy strategies towards the virus, that we have to choose whether we want, on the one hand, save lives, or on the other hand, save our economy. So when my co-author Zach and I started to work on this problem, that was the mindset we had. We thought, okay, there is this trade-off between lives and livelihoods. How can we best analyze that? And what is, given our valuation of lives, because, you know, economists have this habit of trying to put everything in comparable units. So for example, in the US government, there is a whole league of economists that tries to quantify how much should we value lives versus the cost of safety precautions. And they come up with something like a statistical value of life that they pin at around $10 million. So there's certain ethical concerns around this, of course, that I do not want to discount by any means. But whenever policymakers have to trade off incurring costs versus saving lives, they have to use a conversion factor, and that conversion factor is called the statistical value of life. So when we started our project, we very much thought that we have to think about this trade-off of lives versus livelihoods. But what we realized very quickly is that there is in fact no such trade-off. The trade-off only exists in the very short run. So if your horizon is the next 2 weeks, then you're right. You can look at it as a trade-off, and we could, for example, just reopen our entire economy and all go back to normal activities. But then we know that after 2 weeks, case numbers would have roughly quadrupled. After 4 weeks, we would start to see a surge in hospitalizations. After 6 weeks, we would start to see a surge in deaths and so on. And that means the trade-off is really, really short-lived. If our horizon is more than 2 weeks, there really is no trade-off, because the worst thing for our economy is that every time we leave the house, we have to be worried about getting infected. So the more the COVID-19 pandemic gets out of control, the worse it is for our economy. And in fact, worrying about lives and worrying about the economy leads to precisely the same outcomes once your horizon is more than 2 weeks. So this is very much a false trade-off. And in a couple of minutes, I will talk a little bit more about what that implies for our public health strategies. Let me pause for a little bit, and let me ask if anybody has questions at this point. And I want to invite questions because I realize that on Zoom, having just a monologue going on for 45 minutes is a little boring. Does anybody have thoughts, questions, clarifications even? The other thing I realize is on Zoom, I actually have to wait for 15 seconds to make people speak. So I will pause for 15 seconds now and wait, and I very much hope somebody will have a question.
So we have a question that was sent in the chat, and it's, what value of life did you use in your study, if any?
So yeah, that's an important question, and a question that we economists face all the time. And as I mentioned before, there is this concept that the government uses that's called the statistical value of life. So what we have done in our study is we have written down this general problem about the trade-off of lives versus livelihoods without making a specific assumption. But then we have solved the problem, imposing a whole range of different estimates that people before us have used. One of the main estimates we used was what the government employs as the statistical value of life. And they say that the statistical value of life that people employ in their own safety decisions is about $10 million. We have also used other values. We have used things that are lower. For example, if you only look at the lost wages that arise when a life is lost, you would arrive at lower numbers, something in the order of magnitude of perhaps 500,000. We have also looked at significantly larger values. And the interesting thing is, for our main conclusions, the value that we employed really doesn't matter. We found that as long as you impose more than a value of, let's say, $10,000, which I think is a no-brainer to use as a lower bound, all our conclusions are quite robust. So no matter what value of life you use, as long as it's a reasonable value, we found that our advice for public health strategies would be the same.
Understood. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much for bringing the question in. Okay, so let me switch to my next slide now. So one of the big picture questions that countries around the world have faced is, what are the public health strategies that we should employ to deal with this pandemic? And in particular, there have been two major strategies that countries have followed. One of them was to pursue what epidemiologists call herd immunity. And the other one has been to pursue what is called containment and eradication. So if you look at this slide that I just put up, you can in fact see that in some countries around the world, here we have listed China, South Korea, but also my own home country, which was Austria, before I pursued my PhD, have been really quite successful in containing the virus. A bunch of other countries, and in the second row, we have the US, we have Sweden, we have Russia, have either not attempted to or not been able to contain the virus and are more or less on track to what we call herd immunity, more or less on track to let the virus spread through the population, of course, with a significant number of hospitalizations and a significant number of deaths involved. One thing you can see is that I haven't updated the graph for about a month, and I should apologize for that. I used to update it roughly every week or two, but it became more and more depressing for me to do so. So I haven't updated it for a couple of weeks now. I should mention that even the countries in the first row have had small resurges of the virus. When I say small, it means in the order of kind of doubling the very low case numbers that they had at the bottom, but they are really on a completely different trajectory from the countries in the second row. So if we have these different strategies for health interventions, the question is, which one of them is the optimal one? And one of the big questions, and that's where this whole issue of externalities comes in, is should we let public officials impose public health measures, or should we simply let individuals decide on their own how much to distance? And if you think about it for a while, you can notice that there is this collective action problem, there is this externality problem that I spoke about in the very beginning. My actions to get out there and go shopping, work, study, party may impinge upon your freedom, and in particular, your freedom from disease, because I could infect you if I'm a carrier. So in my work with Zach, we actually tried to quantify the magnitude of this externality. And what we found was that a person who is infected with COVID and who disregards the advice on social distancing imposes a cost of $50,000 to $80,000 per week on the rest of society. Now, going back to the earlier question, for this particular number, we used the main number that the government reports for the statistical value of life, which is approximately $10 million. And it scales if you change that number. So if you believe it should be a higher value, you can just multiply by the respective factor. If you believe it should be a lower value, you can divide it accordingly. So that's the total magnitude of the externalities that we found. And again, that is per week. And what do these externalities consist of? Well, they consist of three things. The first one is that if we infect somebody, infection rates go up, economic activity will go down because everybody becomes even more scared of infections, and everybody reduces how much they go out. The second factor is from the value of statistical life that we discussed before. And the third factor that enters the calculation is that if one person infects another one, the other one is likely to spread it even further, and they spread it more, and so on and so forth. So the fact that we cause an infection cascade when we become infected. So that is what this number of $50,000 to $80,000 is made up of. Now, what are the strategies that we should employ in the face of this virus? So the first one I brought up was the herd immunity strategy. The second possibility, and in some sense that describes what we all did in March, is a blind containment strategy. And Zach and I, we called it blind because it assumes that we cannot distinguish between who is infected and who is healthy. And so that means we cannot target our policies at the infected individuals. We have to engage in very, you may call them blunt, broad-scale policies like generalized lockdowns. So when the epidemic started in March, we started to engage in these lockdowns because our testing capacity was very limited. Our tracing capacity was really limited. And so we could not distinguish between who are the infected individuals and who are healthy. And we only had these broad brush strategies at our disposal. The hope was at the time that we can get the virus somewhat under control. And once it is under more control, we can use the time we have gained in the meantime to ramp up our testing capacity, to ramp up our tracing capacity, and to switch over to what we call a smart containment strategy. The smart containment strategy basically makes sure that we test, trace, and quarantine all infected individuals. And if we are really good at doing that, the healthy part of the population can go about their life without having to be worried about being infected. And then economic activity can recover much more closely to what is normal. And I will switch back 2 slides now. So in the countries in the upper row, you can actually see that life right now is much closer to normal again than in the countries in the second row. because they have been quite successful at employing this smart containment strategy. And therefore, people can reopen much more, and people who do go out don't have to be as worried about becoming infected. Now, unfortunately, here in the US, we have not been successful at switching to the smart containment strategy. I think part of the problem was that our testing capacity kind of lagged behind. Part of the problem was that a bunch of states reopened too soon before we could get the virus under control. And part of the problem was also that we had so much political disagreement on whether it is actually desirable to really contain the virus or whether we should pursue the herd immunity strategy. So that's why we face ourselves in this situation now, depicted here in the first panel in the second line, where case counts are continuing to rise in the US. Now, let me spend 3 more minutes looking ahead, and then after that, I want to turn it over to you all, and I hope we can have a little bit more of a discussion. So looking ahead, people are talking of different waves of the virus, and they're talking about how concerned we should be about new waves and so on and so forth. What I want to emphasize is that the virus itself really doesn't know any waves. The waves only arise as a result of our collective behavior. So if we all decide to ignore these externalities, we all decide to go out, stop taking precautions, and stop worrying about the virus. I think a bunch of people did that at the beginning of the summer. Then it will re-emerge and resurge again. And then it looks like a wave, but of course the epidemiological dynamics behind the wave were exactly the same that they have always been. The virus just reproduces in a very predictable manner. When people lower their guard, the virus will resurge. So there are no waves coming from the virus, but there are waves coming from our collective human behavior. And that's really what we should be concerned about. The second point I want to touch upon is, what is our end game? And it seems that now that the virus is so widespread, the only end game is to achieve herd immunity, to achieve immunity for the entire population. Now, of course, there's 2 ways of going about that. The high-tech case is to have a successful vaccination program. And on that front, I actually hear that things look brighter than they look on most other fronts. And we may have a vaccine that can be started to roll out perhaps as early as November. Maybe it's going to be more December or January, but it should be something like half a year away from now. And so that's really good news. The older low-tech way of achieving herd immunity would have been to just let the virus spread through the population. And I hope this is something that we will be able to avoid. Because, you know, if you look at the US population, there's about 330 million people. The case fatality rate of COVID-19 is something like 2/3 of a percentage point. And if you multiply 2/3 of a percent times 330 million people, you can see that letting the virus really spread through the population would lead to a significant number of fatalities. Not to mention, of course, all the people, a much larger number, that would have to spend time on ventilators, that would have to spend time in ICUs, and so on. And many of them may potentially have long-lasting effects from the virus. So a lot of the people who go to ICUs won't come back the same way that they went in. Now, my third bullet point here is implications for the future. And what I mean by that is the future after which we have gotten COVID under control. Let's say the future when everybody is vaccinated, and the future when life will return to something like a new normal. And there are, in fact, two different aspects of that future that I want to discuss. The first one is that COVID-19 has really already led to a change in our society. And it has led into a change in how we organize our economy. It has made personal interactions, physical interactions between people, much more costly because they always expose us to the threat of becoming infected right now. And so that has already led to a whole range of automation decisions to introduce new technologies that cut out physical interactions. They start from little things like touchless payment technologies to things like pizza deliveries by robot and to e-commerce as opposed to people going to a store. And in some ways, COVID-19 has accelerated all these technological advances by, I would estimate, at least 5 years. Now, the second point I want to emphasize is it has also really led to a rearrangement in how people work and a rearrangement in how people interact. So all of us are on this Zoom call right now, and half a year ago, I would have found the idea of telling people about my paper on a Zoom call as basically being so boring that I wouldn't want to bear with it. Now this is the only way of disseminating our ideas. And it has really led to a change in societal conventions, and it has led organizations, schools, corporations to completely restructure the way that they are approaching how we connect with each other. And they have made things possible that were completely unthinkable just a couple of months ago. So let me give you a very personal example from my teaching strategy. I specialize, aside from writing a paper about COVID, I specialize in the economics of AI, and in particular the economics of long-term AI, when machines may become as intelligent as us humans. And that's I find really interesting topic, but still a topic that's kind of a specific niche that only a select number of people around the world are interested in. And most of my colleagues at my university are working on other topics and are not super interested in this specific topic. But thanks to new virtual technologies, I've been able to do things like organize a seminar where some of the leading thinkers in the world on this topic can interact with each other without having to travel. And we had 500 people Zoom in on that particular webinar. Going forward in the fall semester, I will organize a course, and actually it's going to be a MOOC on Coursera that specifically deals with the long-term economics of AI, the economics of super intelligent machines. And again, this is a niche theme for which I probably wouldn't have enough of an audience at my specific university. But now that you can offer your teachings to everybody in the world, it is suddenly something that I can offer much more broadly. So yeah, those are some of the implications for the future, where the pandemic has really accelerated technological change and new innovations. And so those are, again, some of the silver linings of what is otherwise really a pretty bleak development that we have all had to deal with over the past half years. Okay, so now let's open the floor. I see there's already 2 questions in the Zoom group chat. Let's maybe start with Srushti. Srushti, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us all about your question?
Yeah, so I was just wondering about if a country were to implement in like a vaccination system, how expensive would it be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question and an important question. And there are two parts to the answer. One of them is how expensive would it be to develop and distribute the vaccine? And the other one is how much would people actually have to pay to receive the vaccine? And the difference would basically be profits by a big pharma corporation, right? And so my understanding is that the pure cost of developing and developing, testing, distributing the vaccine would be significant and will be significant. It could easily reach single-digit billions, so it could well be above a billion, especially given that we have to try so many things in parallel, and we don't know which one will work. So it's a probabilistic thing. And in expectation, we will probably spend several billion on a vaccine. But you know, the cost of not having COVID under control is in the trillions. So it's by a factor of 1,000 greater. And even if we allow for drug companies to make quite significant profits on this, I think they should make some profits, but they shouldn't make disproportionate profits, given that so much of this is being supported by public funds as well. It is well worth it. Does it make sense? I also believe it would be in the interest of our country to make sure that everybody, even those who don't have access to health insurance, should get a COVID vaccine, just because there are these large positive externalities from being vaccinated. So every time you vaccinate somebody, you reduce the risk for everybody else to become infected, and you can again quantify the magnitude of that externality. And given the typical costs of vaccines, it would be well worth it to provide it to everybody in the US who is willing to and able to tolerate vaccination. Cheryl, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. I know you mentioned 3 strategies like herd immunity, blind containment, and smart containment. So like which one is best for like different situations?
Yeah, so that's also a really good question. So what we find is the smart containment strategy saves the US economy $10 trillion compared to the herd immunity strategy. Again, 10 trillion. So that's basically half of our annual GDP. And the reason is if you can really contain it in a way like China or South Korea or Austria have done it, you can go back to more normal activities so much more quickly. And you don't need to live in a depressed economy for the next 9 months or whenever the vaccine is distributed throughout the population. Now, the problem with the smart containment strategy is that it may not be feasible everywhere. And in particular, right now in the US, we are at a point where case numbers are so high, and in particular in some of the southern states, Florida, Arizona, Texas, case numbers are so high that it's logistically almost impossible to track everybody down who has had contact with an infected individual. And so that means once you are at that stage, the blind containment strategy, which is more generalized lockdowns, is really the only thing you can rely on. The blind containment strategy still saves a couple of $1 trillion compared to the herd immunity strategy, but it's significantly more costly than smart containment. So yeah, my ranking is smart containment is best, blind containment is a distant second best, and the herd immunity strategy is the least desirable. And as soon as we have a vaccine, we should take advantage of it. I should also add that because that's not listed in these three as an explicit strategy. Johnny.
Oh, I just kind of had like a question about what the kind of timeline is to resume travel, especially like between countries that might have one country that has more COVID cases and another country that is like already into containment. And a second question is like, how is COVID affecting countries that heavily depend on tourism for their GDP?
Yeah, that's a really interesting issue. And, you know, my country of origin, Austria, is in that situation. They had brought the virus really well under control, but at the same time, they rely a lot on tourism. And that's part of why they reopened probably a little bit too much in early July, and why they have seen a small resurge of the case numbers. Nothing compared to what we have here, but still a doubling of case numbers. So I think the difficult thing is, if you are a country that relies on tourism, relying on tourism is a relative thing. And in almost all cases, tourism is still less than 10% of your total economy. And it probably still makes sense to keep visitors from the most infected countries out. But yeah, the really interesting thing that you bring up is that there has really been significant deglobalization because of this. And in some sense, visitors from countries with high infection rates have kind of become international pariahs. So if you look at the European Union, they don't allow Americans to visit the EU right now because our case numbers at present are so high that it would impose undue risk. On the other hand, within the European Union, there is a lot of tourism going on. So there is a lot of reallocation of people who would have traveled afar to travel to closer destinations. And we can see the same within the US. Within the US, people are going, let's say, to their country home instead of going to some far off tourist destination. So tourism has become a lot more local, and especially in countries with high case rates, that's probably to stay until we have a vaccine. Is that, does that answer your question, or would you like to follow up on any particular aspects? Because there were a bunch of sub-questions, I'm not sure I answered all of them.
Yeah, you answered my main question, basically. Thank you.
Great. Shall we move to Dia?
Yes, so my question was, you mentioned earlier how the cost of coronavirus in a week is around 50 to 80,000. So my question was, does that take into account the social cost of potentially spreading it to others?
Yeah, that's all inclusive. So that includes the economic cost, the cost on you yourself. 50 to 80, that's the externality of engaging in social activity when you're supposed to be distancing. That includes, first and foremost, the costs that you impose on others. So let's say the possibility that you will infect others, and if you infect others, the fact that they will lose out economically, they suffer an increased risk of death, and furthermore, they may spread it to yet more people. So it's those three factors. Okay.
And then the number of people that they can spread it to, is there a way to measure it, or is there just like a base number?
So when you have a population where nobody is engaging in any social distancing and everybody acts just like normal, then the rate at which the disease spreads is what is called R0. You may have heard about that expression, reading the news or reading lots of things nowadays. So R naught is the baseline rate of transmission. And for COVID, it's in the order of magnitude of 2.5. So that means if we all just lived completely normally, then every infected individual spreads it on average to 2.5 others.
Okay.
So in some sense, what you can immediately see from that is, 1 over 2.5 is 0.4.
Mm-hmm.
If we all reduce our activity by 60%, then you would get the rate of transmission to be at 1. And if we reduce it by more than 60%, then the rate of transmission would decline past 1. And that means case numbers would start to slowly decline and we would start to get the virus under control. So in some ways, that's the math behind lockdowns. We want to get the R, it's called the RT. The RT is the transmission rate at any given time t, which depends on the R naught and on our level of social interactions. You want to get the RT to go below 1, because that's when the virus starts to decline in the population.
Got it. Thank you so much. And then the other question I had was, what public infrastructure should countries build to make sure the future pandemic doesn't spread as fast as COVID did, or even like public policy?
Yeah, that's a really important forward-looking question. And in some ways, it's a question that we are facing every 5 or 10 years. So when SARS started to spread in the 2000s, everybody was really scared. Everybody thought about how can we prepare for the next pandemic. When Ebola got out of control, at least locally, in Western Africa in the early 2010s, everybody got really scared and everybody said, oh, how can we prepare for the next pandemic? And still, this one hit us and we were in many ways so unprepared, right? There's, I want to say, there's probably 3 problems that are linked to that. First problem is people have a very short memory, and things maybe at the top of the policy agenda now are suddenly forgotten 5 years from now. I think COVID-19 is unfortunately bad enough that people won't have it forgotten in 5 years, but they may have forgotten about it in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah.
The second thing is no pandemic is alike. So if you were prepared for Ebola, which is transmitted mainly through bodily fluids, doesn't mean that you were prepared well for COVID. And that means you can apply the lessons from one pandemic only within limits to the next pandemic. And the third lesson, or maybe it's not really a lesson, but the third concern that I want to bring up is that, as we are entering an era in which our medical technologies and our biochemical technologies are ever more advanced, I think we do really have to be concerned about the next pandemic being caused by a synthetic virus. There are even some people who say, well, maybe this one was actually created in a lab. I personally don't think that's my mainline scenario, but I could well imagine that a future pandemic may actually be created by a bug that was generated in a lab. And what that tells us is that we should really start to think very seriously at a global level about biosafety, about what can we do to ensure that just like we prevented a nuclear arms race, at least to some extent, we contained the nuclear arms race around the world over the past 60 years. We should all 60, 70 years. We should also try really hard to make sure that we won't have a an arms race in these new biotechnologies that could potentially create much more deadly and much more dangerous germs even than what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, thank you so much explaining the availability bias of the pandemic and such. I think we have one final question by Cheryl.
Cheryl?
I was just following up on Dia's question, like going back to the 50 to 80K, how exactly did you come up with that number?
Yeah, that's a somewhat involved question. So I'll tell you a little bit about the type of economic model that we set up. We developed an economic model where we analyzed the optimal behavior of an individual who has to choose how much economic activity to engage in versus how much risk to take on, given that they know that there is a certain baseline rate of the virus in their environment. And then we took the same kind of model and we asked the question, well, what would a benevolent social planner do who would face exactly the same problem, but who recognizes the externalities? So the only difference between the two problems is the individual takes into account that they may get sick, but doesn't, they behave like the typical Homo economicus. They don't care about the fact that once they are sick, they may spread it to others. They behave in this rational but completely self-centered way. And the planner behaves in an ethical way, you may want to say. The planner takes into account that you can spread the virus if you have it, and that will impose a cost on others. And we found that the planner would behave with much more precaution because of these externalities. And we essentially asked the question in the model, what is the monetary value of that externality that the private agents impose on others when they don't take that infection risk into account? And depending on how everybody else in the economy behaves, if everybody else in the economy follows the herd immunity strategy and does not care about the externalities, then we found that each individual imposes an externality of 80,000. If everybody else in the economy behaves carefully, then each individual that is infected but does not follow the social distancing guidelines would behave the smaller externality of 50,000 because the rest of society would be much more cautious and therefore the infections would spread less. Does that more or less answer the question?
That makes sense, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Korinek.
So let me hand it back to you as the organizers now. I think we are at our time T, as we call it in economic models.
All right. Thank you for attending day 2 of our speaker series. And a big thank you to Professor Korinek for speaking with us today. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific time, we'll be hosting Rakesh Vora, a professor at UPenn, who will be talking about the overview of economics in a pandemic. And on Friday at 1 p.m., Dan Gode, a professor from NYU, will be talking about investing. All the Zoom links can be found at linktree/the.yi. A follow-up email with all the slides and resources will be sent out to you guys later today. So make sure to fill out our feedback form at bit.ly/moderneconfeedback. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for speaking to us today.
And stay safe and make sure to internalize your externalities.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.